For decades, researchers have found that teachers in public schools have undervalued the potential for academic success among students of color, setting lower expectations for them and thinking of cultural differences as barriers rather than assets to learning. To address this, scholars and teacher educators created several frameworks for culturally responsive approaches. In 1994, Gloria Ladson-Billings coined the term culturally relevant pedagogy, which offers intentional instructional strategies that empower all students, especially students of color, to become lifelong learners and critical thinkers. Ladson-Billings credits her development and definition of culturally responsive pedagogy to many scholars, including Paulo Freire, who advocates for critical pedagogy. In Freire's 1970 Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he shares that the structure of our society has created oppression. The solution is to transform that structure so the oppressed can become beings for themselves. Cynthia Fordham and John U. Ogbu points out the phenomenon called acting white, where African American students fear being ostracized by their peers for demonstrating interest and success in academic tasks. In their 1986 article, they share that white Americans traditionally refused to acknowledge that Black Americans were capable of intellectual achievement, which led to self-doubt and discouragement. Molefe K. Asante argues that students need to be centered. In his 1991 article, he shares that students are empowered when information is presented in a way where they feel like they are part of the information, centering their own culture. Ladson-Billings' culturally relevant pedagogy rests on 3 criteria. Students must experience academic success. Teachers attend to students' academic needs by valuing all students' skills and abilities. For example, recognizing a student's social power and leveraging that skill academically. Students must develop and/or maintain cultural competence, which requires that students maintain some cultural integrity. For example, encouraging home language while learning academic language. Students must develop cultural consciousness, which allows students to critique the cultural norms, values, and institutions that produce and maintain social inequities. For example, using the required state curriculum framework as an opportunity to examine conventional interpretations and introduce alternate ones, leaving the curriculum open to critical analysis. Speaking of critical analysis, imagine you're a high school English teacher, and your school requires that your students read To Kill a Mockingbird, an American classic about destroying innocence, how good and evil coexist in a dark drama about the roots and consequences of racism and prejudice. While the conventional interpretation of the text leaves many students to reinforce stereotypes about white heroes and Black victims, you can revise the approach to provide a rich ground for teaching students about power and oppression. Plan for instruction using backwards design. Pose essential questions like, how does this text represent race? Design assessments to match those objectives. Then think about specific lessons to help scaffold student learning. Disrupt typical literary analysis by incorporating critical questions like, for characterization, to what extent does the text reflect or challenge racial stereotypes of whiteness or Blackness? For plot, to what extent is race a factor in the central conflicts of this text? For theme, what messages about race and racism are conveyed through the central themes? Ladson-Billings' call to action for us as teachers is to not shy away from conducting our own research about our practice. This work is designed to challenge us to reconsider what we mean by good teaching, to look for it in some unlikely places, and to challenge those who suggest it cannot be made available to all children.